Welcome to the Andrew Holland Podcast, where we talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Now, here's your host, Andrew Holland.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Andrew Holland Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Holland. I'm a businessman, I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm a CPA that's worked in the investment and financial services industries. I've also started multiple companies that have achieved millions of dollars in revenue, and I've sold companies with multi-million dollar valuations. You can find out more about my background at our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com. Follow me on Twitter and now Threads with my handle, A Holland Podcast. That's A Holland Podcast. And you can join us in conversations that we have outside of the podcast every week. Lastly, subscribe to our YouTube channel, the Andrew Holland Podcast, to make sure that you get the weekly updates when we post the video version every Wednesday of the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us each and every week to talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Now, this week, tailing off of the previous episode, in episode 27, we talked about the power of external consistency. That means being consistent and presenting a consistent image, brand, market, quality of service to the outside world. But just important as that external consistency is internal consistency. And that all stems at the top. And so today, I want to talk about how you, a business owner, an entrepreneur, an executive leader, can enhance your leadership skills and your capabilities by having consistent and stable leadership. And once you do that, I think you'll be surprised at the results of what you can accomplish with the teams that you have. Having been in many small businesses, having worked in the corporate world where there's lots of bureaucracy, there's many levels of management, often, as we've all heard and joked about in lots of movies, middle management often seems pretty pointless. I've seen it all, and I've seen great exemplary opportunities of leadership. I've seen poor examples of leadership, and I've seen what some of the most motivated and powerful teams all have in common, and that is consistent and stable leadership. And having run many small businesses, I learned the importance of just what this means to each and every one of your employees and your colleagues, and the impact that it has on their desire to be at your company and their happiness, their level of happiness. And so, what I want to talk about is how can you have consistent and stable leadership, and why should you care to have consistent and stable leadership? Especially when you're a new entrepreneur and business is new to you and there's so many things that you're trying to accomplish, you're wearing so many hats. It's easy to let this idea of you being the leader of your organization, and it doesn't matter if it's you're the only one, because practicing these habits will be important to you as you look to grow your business and you add more people to your team, or if you're a huge organization of thousands of employees. This concept and this topic can be the determination of whether your company is a resounding success, or whether your company just continues to flutter in its operational goals and desires and remain stagnant. And so, first, before we talk about how can we do this, and why should we do this? Let's define what I mean by consistent and stable leadership. So, consistent leadership really talks about a style of leadership that is steadfast in values, in principles, and how decision making occurs and the approach to with which you make decisions over time. Stable leadership, similar but different, focuses on providing a sense of reliability, predictability, and continuity to the organization or team through time. I like to think about these things as opposed to consistency and stability. And I shouldn't say as opposed to, but in terms of how do you actually carry those out? I like to think about it as character consistency and then operational consistency, providing that level of predictability. So, for all of you who are thinking about starting a business, already in a business, and you're the owner of the business, you're the leader of the business, and to all of you who are executive leaders, and what's interesting to think about is if you read any article in Fortune 500 or Forbes or the Wall Street Journal, obviously the most well-known leaders are the ones of the largest public companies, the ones we see on a day-to-day basis. They have global presences or global presence, and you see them on CNBC, Fox Business, wherever you consume your business news. And of course, as I said, quoted in many articles. They often think, or we often think, that those leaders have all of this figured out. And based on my corporate experience and many, 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 many years of, I shouldn't say many, many, but many years of reading articles and studying leadership and reading books like From Good to Great, oftentimes those CEOs in the most well known and public companies have not gotten there because of their consistent and stable leadership. They have perhaps gotten there for ulterior motives or various reasons, and they don't embody the real principles that foster an incredible culture of trust, engagement, and empowerment for their employees. And so I want you to, if you're in a business or you're an entrepreneur, to not hear this and say, well, that's for people leading large organizations. Wrong. It's for anybody leading any business. And quite frankly, it doesn't, nonprofits, any group that you're a part of, the concepts that we're going to talk about, if you are put in a leader position of providing consistency and stability, if you can think about these and take active notice of them and actively work on improving what we're going to talk about and being able to make, I shouldn't say make, but foster an environment where you have consistent and stable leadership, you will be setting yourself up for a tremendous amount of success. And you'll find that others will gather around you. So, how do you do this? Character consistency and operational consistency. First, I want to talk about character consistency. Anybody can start a business. That doesn't mean anybody is capable of running a business. That doesn't mean that anyone is capable of being a leader of a business. And for me, I've talked about this a lot in the podcast, having started a business so young at 22 or 23, and being put in a position of leadership, small organization, but we grew. This is in the garbage company, Provider Waste Services. As I've said, I've owned multiple companies. We had a manufacturing company. It's still in existence. It's not quite as large as it was, and it was focused or started at the height of the pandemic. Wisconsin Medical Supplies. We had up to 25 employees at one point. You start to learn quickly that if you don't think about these concepts, all of the efforts that you put into marketing, all of the external consistency that you have to grow your business are futile. If you don't think about the internal consistency and the whole internal environment that you create with your organization, and it starts at the top. There's a reason that that saying, the buck stops here, is so meaningful, and one that you can try to ignore and you can try to pass the blame, but it never ends ultimately well for you if you're really trying to grow the organization and your team the way you need to have a successful business. So, when I talk about these things, ask yourself these questions. Am I the type of leader that has character consistency, or do I exhibit personality traits? We've had multiple episodes on personality traits. Do I exhibit personality traits that I need to work on or be mindful of? And as we've said in previous episodes, personality traits can be really hard to change over time, but if you're aware of them, you can certainly work on mitigating the negative impacts of the natural tendencies. And we all have natural tendencies that are negative or make it more challenging to be a leader in business. Character consistency. What does that mean? That means starting off with emotion. I've talked a lot about emotional intelligence in this podcast, and I will continue to do so because, as I've pontificated many times in this podcast, in this day and age of technology where we get everything we want so quickly, and I believe that the technology is truly messing with our neural networks and our ability to handle conflict in a healthy way, this is something you have to focus on. And I would encourage not only you to focus on it, but to have these conversations with your teams. Quite frankly, outside of work, with your family, in relationships, because as this technology becomes present everywhere, and it just keeps going faster and faster. We've talked about artificial intelligence, and who knows what's that going to do to our neural networks and our ability to deal with conflict and have emotional stability. But as a leader, you have a requirement, you have an obligation, a much higher bar, a much higher standard of being mindful of your emotional stability. And so when I talk about character consistency, and again, this is all in the context of providing environment where it's viewed that there is consistent and stable leadership. When I talk about character consistency, one of the things under that is emotional stability. How do you deal with stress? When you have, and everybody's watching you, how do you deal with the most challenging moments? Do you have a short wire? Are you quick to anger? Whether you realize it or not, and this took me a long time to learn in my 20s, but I eventually had it pounded into me because of a lot of failures. Everybody is watching you. And when I say everybody, I'm talking about in the context of your organization. When you're running a business, your employees look to you for stable leadership and for emotional stability. And if you exhibit poor signs or poor habits in this area, that not only leaves them with perhaps a feeling of uncertainty on, is this person capable? Is this part of an organization, especially if you're small and you're looking to grow, that I want to be a part of if this person isn't emotionally stable? But it also opens the door for them to say, well, if he can be that way, that means it's okay in this organization for me to blow off a customer or for me to treat another one of my colleagues with disrespect when I'm having a bad day or something's happening in my personal life and so I'm bringing it to work. On the contrary, if you establish a culture like that, and all of these things we're talking about really goes to the foundation of establishing a healthy culture. And it starts with you as a leader and providing consistent and stable leadership. And this is one piece of that emotional stability. If you provide an unhealthy culture where it is easy or accepted, I should say, for people to be emotionally unstable, that does not result in a positive outcome in any scenario that I've ever experienced. And it's not a great place to work. When have you ever been around someone, whether in a personal relationship or in a business relationship, you're not sure what's going to set them off. And so you're always on edge, kind of tiptoeing because you know they have a relatively short wire or they're emotionally unstable. It creates an incredible amount of undue stress on you, on the human psyche. And imagine the impact that that stress is having on your emotional psyche. And if you're utilizing that much energy to tiptoe around this particular person, maybe it's a boss. You're currently working in the corporate world and you feel that way. Or maybe it's a colleague. You have to find a way to either remove yourself from that situation or find a healthy way to deal with it, whether it's approaching that person or basically finding a different department or what have you. Now, if you're the leader and you're the one that's emotionally unstable, what do you expect your employees to do? You sign their paychecks every single week. Do you think it's going to be easy for them to come to you and say, "Hey, Andrew, I wanted to talk about how you handled that situation." And it seemed to me that, yes, it was a challenging situation and perhaps the customer was in the wrong, but I don't think that the way that you handled that was appropriate, and I don't think it was healthy for our business. That's very challenging to do. And let me tell you, if you're a leader and you have an employee that respectfully is able to do that, never lose that employee, because that is something that you will want to foster, and you will want that person behind you in your company, uh, as long as they're willing and able to continue to go on that path of entrepreneurial growth with you, because that is a trait, the ability to stand up to leadership in a respectful way when they're wrong, that the strongest organizations have had. This is the concept of yes men and women versus people that stand up to you and say, hey. Now, I'm not talking about defy or doing it in a disrespectful way, but this all goes back to your emotional stability, character consistency. How do you deal with the most challenging situations? And whether you like it or not, as a leader of an organization or as a small business owner or entrepreneur, you're being watched. You're being watched by your employees, and they're making determinations every single day on what's acceptable in this organization. What does our culture allow? How is it okay for me to act? Now, that's not to say, obviously, every human has good days and bad days, and we all make mistakes. We're never going to achieve perfection. But what I'm saying when I talk about having a higher bar for you as a leader is you need to be more mindful of that. And you need to remember that you're being watched and that the actions that you take have a tremendous impact on all of the people that you work with and all of the colleagues that you work with, people you employ. And we're talking about internal consistency, but quite frankly, it extends beyond the walls of your business and into the communities that your business operates, whether that's in your local town, in the United States, or you have an international presence. How you compose yourself, how you conduct yourself, how you deal with challenging times, your emotional stability is crucial to establishing consistent and stable leadership. On the same topic, again, we're talking about how do you establish an organization with consistent and stable leadership. And you, as a leader in your organization, as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, are you doing the things that you can do about who you are and how you're viewed to set your business up for success? Trust, ethics. What how are you viewed in your organization in terms of how you operate, your character, who you are? And this is a little bit different from emotional stability. That is short fuse, quick to anger, relatively patient. Which one of those are you? It's being able to control yourself under stress. This more is when you give your word, do people trust that you're going to follow it? Or do you say one thing to one person, another thing to another person, or say one thing to a certain circumstance, or say another thing under a different circumstance? And I guess the best way to sum this concept up is values. Are your morals, principles, and values consistent? Or do you just act like a reed in the wind? And when it's for more money, your value system is one way. And when it's for less money, your value system and how you treat people is a different way. If that's the case, you need to have a good long look at yourself in the mirror, because not only is it going to make your life far more challenging and it's going to appear as if you don't stand for anything and you're going to be like a ship without a rudder in the midst of a stormy tempest, but everybody watching you is going to feel perhaps uneasy because they don't know how you operate. They don't know whether you can be trusted. If they don't know that your values are consistent, how do they know when your ethics or when what you say you're going to do is going to actually happen? And so, as a leader, if you're viewed in a positive manner when it comes to a consistent application of morals, principles, and values versus an inconsistent application of morals, principles, and values, you get a very different resulting culture. And for me, I've talked a lot about this. My value system stems from the fact that I'm a Christian and that the Bible means everything to me. And we don't talk a lot about religion on this podcast. And I'm not talking about, let's not talk about specific religions, but let's just talk about treating others as you would like to be treated. Is that a consistent value for you as a leader within how you operate? If you treat a certain socioeconomic class of people one way and another set of socioeconomic class a different way, and I don't say the specific class, but perhaps you uh, Google over the wealthy and people who are perhaps less fortunate, you frown upon or you treat them differently, that's not very appealing, not only as a leader, but just basically as a human. So, the point in saying all this is when you're thinking about how you and your organization can foster and create a level of respect for you and create a culture that's consistent and reliable, it starts with you, the leader of the organization. And if you don't think about, we've talked about emotional stability and now the application of your value system and whether you can be, whether how you will react or how you would deal with a certain situation, if that can't be determined, and again, we're talking very high level, we're talking more about, I want to say more strategy, for example, or just how you operate as a human, how you act on a day to day basis. We're not talking about tactics and goals at this point. We're talking about just how you treat people. What does your value system look like? If your colleagues and your employees have a solid foundation or understanding of how you're going to be, regardless of the situation, and how you're going to treat people, and it's a positive view, you're much more likely to create a culture with consistent and stable leadership and one that is set up for success. If people have no idea how you're going to decide on an issue or how you make the decisions that you make, particularly in the most challenging or ethical situations, you are creating a culture where you're not only creating confusion, but you're leaving it up to every individual within your organization because they're watching the leader who just makes decisions on a whim and doesn't really have a foundation or basis of or value system to make determinations on. They're going to do the same thing, and you're going to have a very broken, non cohesive organization, and it just won't work in the marketplace. And one of the things that you always see the statistics, and I don't remember exactly what they are, whether it's 60 or 70% of all businesses fail within the first year, and 85 or 90% fail within the first 5 years. A lot of it comes down to leadership. And I know it always talks about finances, but finances are the time when your opportunity to really exhibit this consistent and stable leadership approach that we're talking about in the qualities that are exemplary of consistent and stable leadership, when that's when you're given the chance to show those, and that's when culture is built the most. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of character consistency, and then we'll move on to operational consistency. Again, this is all in the uh, understanding or the outline, if you will, of how do you create consistent and stable leadership is attendance, your presence. And this is something that's very, very challenging for many leaders to understand or be cognizant of, especially as they garner more and more success and have more financial freedom to be away from their business, enjoying the fruits of their labor. But it's important for you to be aware of this. So, if you own a business or you're a leader, ask yourself, how many times have you been the first one there in the last 7 days? How many times have you been the last one there in the last 7 days? And not that perhaps you were on vacation the last 7 days, but you understand the concept. Your presence in your business is so incredibly crucial to you creating a culture of consistent and stable leadership, or being viewed as having a company with consistent and stable leadership. When your employees see you in the business, when they see you there before them and after them, and they see that you care so much about making this work, do you know what that does to them? It makes them trust you. It makes them want to be a part of what you're trying to accomplish. And it makes them feel empowered to work as much as you do. Not that you want any of your employees to work as much as you do, because as we've talked about in early episodes, many our society seems to have this idea if you're an entrepreneur, it's the most glamorous and freedom oriented job, if you will, out there, and it's just the opposite. It's 7 days a week, 14, 15, 16-hour days, and that's what you sign up for when you sign up for being an entrepreneur or a business owner. But when your team sees that, when your colleagues see that, it motivates them to be better, to work towards the goals that you're all trying to work towards. On the contrary, and this is why I say it can be very challenging for business owners who have been doing it for, let's say, 25 years, and now they've reaped a huge level of success and they're not present nearly as much, that you need to be mindful of that. Now, that's not to say that after 25 years, you don't have the freedom to do what you want. As a business owner, you always have the freedom to do what you want. But remember, your actions have reactions, and they also are being viewed uh, uh, very closely. And so, if you have established trust and credibility with your team, that's going to give you a lot more freedom to be away after 25 years than if you've just come into an organization. Let's say we're talking in the corporate world and you're executive leader and you're, you know, flying across the world on personal trips and you're doing this, that, and the other thing. And they're thinking, why in the world should I work this hard and care this much about what we're trying to, our goals for the year, or what the mission or purpose we're trying to achieve, when this person at the top doesn't even seem to care and they're never here. I don't see them working. And whether you like it or not, when you're not around, when your presence, your physical presence isn't there, it's natural for us as humans and as employees, especially or colleagues, our minds to wander and assume that you're not working, even when the case may be that you are. So having physical presence in office time, seeing your teams, listening to your teams, being around your teams, being present is one of the most important character traits that any leader needs to think about or be cognizant of. And if you want to establish a culture of consistent and stable leadership, and you don't think about this, you're going to fail, especially in small organizations. Now, when you're in a huge organization, whether it's, pick any large public company, Walmart, I don't care which one you pick, Whole Foods, Amazon, Facebook. Not every employee is going to see you every day. That's not what I'm saying. But they know whether you're working, or they get a sense for whether you're a hard worker and you care as much about what the business is trying to accomplish. And if they feel that you care and that you're working hard to accomplish it, they're going to be more motivated. If they see you off on trips and doing this, that, and the other thing and driving the most amazing things, think about it. Would you want to work for someone that's never there? Would you want to work for someone that says, "Hey, we got to work 50 hours a week to get this done," and that person's, seen in the office 2 or 3 hours? No. Of course you wouldn't, because it's human nature. And as a leader, whether you like it or not, physical presence is a huge determination of all of your team's mindset on how hard you work, how much you care about the organization, and how hard they want to work and fight for your company. And I hate to even see your company, but it is your company because it's a team approach. And your company is nothing without those who are making it work and carrying out the goals and missions that you're trying to accomplish. And if they don't feel that you have any sense of responsibility, or your priorities are elsewhere because you're never there, why should they care? So before we talk about why do you want to have consistent and stable leadership, although it should be pretty obvious, but I think it's important to talk about why this is so crucial, I want to kind of reiterate. How do you do this? Character consistency, emotional stability, having a predictable foundation or value system, morals, principles, how you make decisions, ethically speaking, and being present, have a consistent presence. And sometimes when you're a leader, you do have to be out of the office a lot more. You do have to be traveling more, but that doesn't mean you can't make meaningful touch points. And sometimes they can't always be physical presence, but meaningful touch points with the people in your organization to create and foster that environment of, you know what, I care, I'm working hard, and that's why I'm asking you to do the same. If you can accomplish those three character consistencies, or be consistent in those three character concepts that we just talked about, you're well on your way to fostering and creating a culture of consistent and stable leadership. Now, why do you want to do that? Why does it matter? Well, we've talked about a few of those things, but you've started a business, presumably to achieve a certain mission or purpose, and presumably to chase the American dream, to improve your and your family's financial well being. We don't start businesses to not make money. You start businesses to make money, but that shouldn't be necessarily the driving force, but it's certainly a force that is there and is normal. So, if you want to actually accomplish the mission or purpose that you're trying to achieve with your business, and you do want to be successful, financially speaking, as a result of your entrepreneurial endeavor, that's why you care about consistent and stable leadership. Because the organizations that are the most successful in achieving their goals and having financial stability and creating incredible lives, not only for the owners of the organization, perhaps the shareholders if it's a public company, but most importantly, a great experience for your customers and a survivable living for your employees, for those making your organization what it is. That's why you should care about this. The way that you do this is you build a culture of trust. If you are viewed as being a consistent and stable leader, you will be someone that your employees want to follow, that want to work for your organization, that trust you in the things you ask them to do and the things you say that your organization is trying to accomplish. Trust, that is one of the most foundational elements of any relationship, whether it's a friendship, whether it's a personal relationship, and whether it's a colleague relationship, employee leader relationship, which is what we're specifically talking about. You have an incredible opportunity to build trust and credibility with your colleagues, with your employees, by having consistent and stable leadership. On the contrary, if you're a leader that's not trusted, throw everything else away. No one cares about you. What you say doesn't matter because you're not trusted. You giving all of these corporate speaks about missions and purposes and goals and strategies and yada yada, no one cares. They don't trust you as a human, so they don't care what comes out of your mouth. And there are so many leaders out there that forget that basic fundamental principle of, if you want to be an organization that people want to work for, and people don't just want to work for to get a paycheck, but they actually feel a connection to, they forgot trust. Trust is the most fundamental basis for any of that to even begin or blossom. Second, empowerment, or I should say, empowerment and engagement. And that's similar to what we just said. If you're a leader who's consistent, who's stable, I've already said people will trust you. And that doesn't happen overnight, of course. Trust is never built overnight. But a consistent pattern, which is what this whole thing is about, consistency, the importance of consistency in your character, how you deal with situations, your emotions, your system of ethics and values, and your being present, consistently showing up all the time. If you're a leader who exhibits those, you build that trust, you build that credibility, and you get engagement from all of your colleagues, from your employees. And that's the only way for an organization to accomplish their mission, no matter whether you're a 2-person team or a 2,000-person team. If you can build a culture of trust and build a culture of engagement and a culture of empowerment. And engagement and empowerment, I kind of used them interchangeably just a couple of minutes ago. They're very different. So I want to talk about engagement and then empowerment. If you can build a culture with those three things, trust, engagement, and empowerment, there's nothing stopping your organization from accomplishing the goals that you're trying to achieve, whether they be purpose driven goals, whether they be financial goals, and it's usually both. And more importantly, you're going to be creating a culture and a workplace that people want to be at, that people don't hate waking up every morning and coming to, and that people are motivated to work for you and excited to help accomplish the missions of the organization. And that all stems with your ability as a business owner, an entrepreneur, an executive leader to create consistent and stable leadership. Empowerment is something that only comes from the top. And we why should you care about being consistent and stable? Because trust, engagement, and empowerment falls into this mix and is a part of a consistent and stable leadership, because when employees feel empowered, they will conquer the world for you, but you have to unleash them and unchain them to use common sense in situations that perhaps are outside of the box. I've said that I've started multiple businesses. We've achieved millions of dollars of revenue. I've sold companies. I've also worked in very large corporations. And this concept of empowerment, the larger your organization gets, the much more challenging it can become, but it is no less as important. And what I mean by that is when you get larger, let's take McDonald's for an example, you have to create, as we talked about, consistency. Consistency externally, quality, customer service, consistency internally, whether it's employee development, how everyone's treated. And so you have to have standard operating procedures to achieve some of these things. So when I talk about empowerment, that almost seems like it's in direct conflict with being consistent. But on the contrary, I've been in organizations where they have these policies and there's no bending these policies. No matter what, there's no flexibility. Well, it's impossible to me to make a set of policies that can work in every situation that can come up in business. And so if you've done a good job in your organization of empowering your employees to take action and go outside of the box, but only in the circumstances where it's necessary so that you can create that customer service consistency, for example, or quality product. Those are the organizations that get it are the most successful, let's put it that way, because getting it right, you're always striving for what we're talking about in this podcast. It's impossible to have perfection. And I have seen as organizations get larger, because you have to put certain strategies and standard operating procedures in place and be a little bit less flexible and dynamic just to achieve that level of consistency, and to have an organization that's not biased, that treats everybody with fairness and respect, etc. You have to put policies in place that can sometimes end up creating an environment where employees don't feel empowered, and they don't feel like they can do the right thing even when they know or believe it to be the right thing, because it's outside of a particular standard operating procedure or policy. And so those are it's always a constant struggle as a leader to make sure that you find the perfect balance, but it's something that if you focus on, you can certainly improve with. So we've talked about how can you create consistent and stable leadership, and why should you create consistent and stable leadership. I'll tell you, if you're looking to start a business and you want to be an entrepreneur, I hope you're listening to this, because the fastest way to give your opportunity or to create yourself up for success to create your fellow business partners up for success, to create an environment where your colleagues and your employees feel like they individually can be successful and that the organization as a whole can be successful, is providing this culture of consistent and stable leadership. I've said that so many times in this podcast, you're probably sick of hearing it. But when I look out into the world, whether I look at politicians having a system of ethics, one that's predictable, throw that out the window. When I look at some of the corruption we've seen in the corporate world, some of the most powerful organizations, and obviously many of us know about Enron, Tyco, you can go down the list. All of these basic principles that we've talked about of creating consistent and stable leadership were missing. They were just thrown out the window, and you can see the results of those. And we have some incredibly successful companies that I believe are missing a lot of these, that are missing an environment of consistent and stable leadership. And are they successful? Sure, financially they might be doing well. But is that really the measure for you as a business owner or entrepreneur of success if the bottom line is huge? Do you have any level of caring about the humans in your organization? As I've said before, business is just an interaction of humans, both internally and externally. So that's what really matters. If you're defining your whole level of success, and that's why you think you can throw out this concept of being consistent and stable leaders just because what you're doing is working and creating huge margins, you're failing. Because creating an environment where people want to work for you and people want to be a part of what you're trying to create, and people aren't miserable waking up every single day to come to your organization and work, and people are motivated and, dare I say, happy working, that's, in my definition, and I believe the right definition of being a successful leader and having a successful business. If you measure it all monetarily, I feel bad for you, because business, entrepreneurship is so much more than that. And if that's your only barometer of success, you're just missing out on life in general, because business is only successful and life is only successful. And I'm talking all from a secular perspective here. When you value the incredible things that other humans have to offer, whether personally or professionally, and when you care about the other things that humans have to offer. And that's why providing a culture of consistent and stable leadership, or just being a consistent and stable leader, is such an important concept. I love talking about leadership. I love talking about these concepts. Hopefully, you're engaged. If you're trying to run an organization and we've talked about something that maybe you've identified as a weakness of yours or something you need to focus on, fantastic. Let me know. Email me at our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com. Reach out to me on Twitter. I love to hear stories from our listeners. I love to hear stories from other business owners where they've been successful here, where they failed here. And I failed so many times on this topic. And it's the only reason I know it's so important, because I've had to work at this continually. And, as I grew in business and grew and mature in life, I'm slowly starting to realize the importance of these. And it's always a constant struggle, especially when there's so many other challenges in business, to talk about these more weighty or meaty concepts of character consistency and what makes a good leader. But they're extremely important. So reach out to me on Twitter or Threads, A Holland Podcast. I'd love to hear from you. Remember, this is a podcast where we talk about financial concepts, sometimes legal concepts. Don't hear something on this podcast or any other podcast for that matter and take it as the actual or the absolute gospel truth. Remember, for every situation that you have, make sure you're getting the appropriate professionals to ensure you're making the right decisions or taking the right approaches so your business can be successful. That's all the time that we have for this week's episode of the Andrew Holland Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great week, and we'll talk again next Wednesday. Thank you for listening to the Andrew Holland Podcast. Be sure to visit our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, for additional content on business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, to get notifications when new podcasts have been released. And lastly, follow us on Twitter, A Holland Podcast. That's A Holland Podcast for all the conversations we're having outside the podcast. Thanks again so much for joining us this week. Have a great day, and we'll talk again next week.